Let's continue working our way through this book, which in my assessment is the shortest, most clearly written and recent summary of many, but not all, many of the issues that we are dealing with in this course. We've done a bit of work on the difference between race and ethnicity. We've had a look at ethnic conflict, about the forms of ethnic conflict that exist, and we are now going through the list of forms of assimilation, accommodation, how nation states accommodate or assimilate or seek to provide, to build a multi-ethnic society. We're halfway through this discussion, and we're going to take things up here, and we're going to be looking at some case studies of assimilation, and we're going to begin with evidence of assimilation as white ethnics. Now, when we do this, I want you to be thinking about the relevance of this for you as Thai students. What is the relevance of this for you? What aspects of your own history of assimilation, accommodation, do you see in these case studies from Europe and North America and elsewhere? And so let's go into full screen and we'll get going. Okay, so recall that back in the 1940s, there were scholars who thought that assimilation was occurring rapidly with white ethnics, immigrants or descendants of immigrants from Europe, while it was in many regards stymied for blacks and some other racial minorities. Here we examine the first part of this claim, and in the following section we turn to the second. The question can be simply put: have white ethnic groups, the Germans, the Danish, the Finns, the Norwegians, the English, the Irish, the Scottish, have they assimilated? The answer is no. If by assimilated we mean that group boundaries have been completely eradicated, as individuals have come out of the melting pot. Their previous ethnic identities have completely disappeared. It's worth noting that neither Park nor Gordon thought that assimilation led to this result. Instead, in Gordon's case, and we haven't dealt a lot with Gordon, we have to be selective about what we talk about, he actually thought that assimilation and what he called cultural pluralism could coexist. This was not what some cultural pluralists during the 1960s and 70s thought. In their view, any evidence of ethnic persistence meant that assimilation had not occurred and was not occurring. Those were what became known as the unmeltable ethnics. There was a great deal of mixing of empirical analysis and social agenda by advocates of what was dubbed ethnic revival amongst European origin ethnics. Whether motivated by a desire to preserve the heritage of a particular group or by a reaction to what were perceived as gains by blacks at the expense of working class whites in the wake of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, the ethnic revival had its moment in the sun. Its short history need not concern us. What is of interest is whether there was evidence to support the claim of some cultural pluralists that assimilation was not occurring. In this regard, the key figure associated with the claim was Andrew Greenlee, making use of data from the National Opinion Research Centre, which captured elements of attitudinal and behavioural features that might reveal the persistent impact of ethnic heritage. He sought to determine the extent to which cultural background had an impact on a variety of personality traits. He hypothesized that because they were more religious than Italians, the Irish would provide evidence of being more trusting. In this particular example, the evidence did not support the hypothesis. And Greeley found overall, what Greeley found overall was a very mixed bag, leading him to offer the following highly qualified summation. In some extent, some dimensions of the ethnic culture do indeed survive and enable us to predict some aspect of behaviour of the children, grandchildren of immigrants. He didn't mention the fact that structural assimilation appeared to be occurring as ethnic institutions were disappearing, along with the use of ancestral language, and ethnic enclaves were being vacated for multi-ethnic suburbs. Moreover, marital assimilation had become increasingly commonplace. Granted, his data did not provide evidence of these aspects of assimilation, but it is curious that he didn't try to connect in some fashion cultural assimilation to Gordon's keystone. The result was, while Greeley was able to illustrate evidence of some persisting patterns of ethnic culture manifesting in personality traits, he fails to offer a framework for understanding what it means and how persistent is connected to counter-evidence pointing to assimilation. So this brings us to the area of symbolic ethnicity. Such an interpretive frame was provided by Columbia University sociologist Gans, who described the ethnic allegiances of European origin ethnics as expressions of symbolic ethnicity. What he meant is that many ethnics no longer were prepared to live by all of the normative expectations required by traditional allegiance to their ethnic group's culture, but rather were intent on holding on to their ethnic identities periodically and selectively, primarily for reasons of nostalgia. So 2 studies considered this idea, and they are cited here, ethnic identity and ethnic opinions, and one was based on interviews in a ramble sample of 524 residents in New York, and the other was predominantly in-depth interviews with 60 white ethnics, Roman Catholics from California and Philadelphia. Both researchers concluded that ethnicity no longer had the same impact on such factors as educational and occupational choice or marital selection as it once did. Moreover, it did not mean that these ethnics found no meaning in their ethnic identities. Rather, ethnicity continued to resonate subjectively with their subjects, though, as Walter's title indicated, it was embraced in a highly selective manner as people opted to pick and choose from their ancestral cultural traditions. So who changes? Who changes? As the descriptions of key assimilation studies in the 1940s to 1990s reveals, the focus of research is on ethnic minorities and not on the larger society. The assumption is that in the process of becoming more alike entails the transformation of members of these groups, unexplored is whether or not the mainstream changes in the process of interaction with ethnic groups over time. So borrowing from a schema proposed by Newman, we examine 4 possible outcomes of intergroup social relations. So what are these 4 outcomes? The first is Anglo-conformity, and that is represented by A plus B plus C equals A, which is the dominant group, the Anglo group. In this scenario, A would represent Anglo-American in the US, B and C might represent Italians, Americans. Here, the change that occurs over time is that Americans and Italians and Mexicans take on the attitudinal behavioural characteristics of English origin dominant group. It is in its most pristine form. This would suggest in the total loss of Italian and Mexican identities as they become amalgamated in the larger Anglo-American pot. We've indicated that the empirical evidence does not support this picture. So the second is unchanging cultural pluralism. However, neither does it support the opposite, which suggests that somehow over a considerable period of intergroup relations, the groups manage to persist unmarked by their encounter with others. So there is no change. A plus B plus C is the same. The third option is called Americanization. This leads to the question, if neither dramatic change from minority groups leading to their elimination, nor a lack of change for all groups has received empirical confirmation, what does the group look like? How would we define it? One possibility would be to go further than the first model above and claim that all groups are so radically transformed that the end result is a qualitatively new identity for all concerned. And it's represented by A plus B plus C equals D. Again, there is no evidence that anything so dramatic has occurred. If it had, one might think of Americans would have abandoned English for Esperanto and Christianity for Baha'i or an original New Age religion. So what is pluralist assimilation? What is pluralist assimilation? We believe that the evidence on hand, and there is a large body of work that has explored immigration to America, as well as equally substantial work on black experience and a smaller but important research on tradition on Native Americans. It calls for a conceptual perspective that appreciates 2 facets. First, intergroup relations have been characterized by both change and persistence. Second, all groups have to some extent been transformed by their encounters with their groups, the majority group and all minority groups. Precisely how this might be captured schematically is somewhat an open question. One possibility, the one we find most convincing, would be the following. A plus B plus C, the dominant group, is a mixture of these A and C and D, and B and C and D, and C and D. What this diagram indicates is a society in which discrete ethnic groups don't disappear, but they're transformed in the process of intergroup interaction. The result is that they come to share a common identity that exists harmoniously with particular ethnic identities. The common identity in question is an overarching national identity, it is not the case that each group in the society has an equal impact on the social construction of that identity. Rather, groups that are large have long histories in the society and have played a dominant role in that society will have a larger impact than groups that are small, have recently arrived and have entered the society as marginalised and oppressed members. Nevertheless, the assumption is that the net result is a national identity that does not simply reflect the image of hegemonic groups. There's another alternative, and that is segmented assimilation. Until recently, when speaking about assimilation, it was assumed that it involved entry into something called the mainstream. As it turns out, this is a very undefined concept. It can be assumed to refer to entry into the middle class, where people share a basic standard of living, lifestyle, and opportunities. Research reveals that this sort of assimilation does occur in a majority of cases, such as the US and the UK, where the middle class constitutes the largest and most diverse class in the society. Nevertheless, there are others who change as a result of their encounter with members of other groups, but the change that occurs does not land them in the mainstream. Recently, Portes, working with various colleagues, has advanced the idea of segmented assimilation to account for this phenomenon. While this may have been an appropriate concept to use in discussing immigrants in the past, the argument has been developed with contemporary post-industrial economies in mind. In the past, manufacturing, particularly unionised, provided a vehicle for new immigrants to improve their economic circumstances and position them to pursue goals and aspirations of the middle class, such as home ownership, university education for children. In short, this became a way for newcomers to gain entry into the middle class. Since deindustrialization of the capitalist economies in the 1970s and 80s, the number of unionized manufactured jobs have decreased. And so things are ever changing. Let's go out of full screen now. Things are ever changing. Our conceptions of assimilation, the models of assimilation and of accommodation, they change depending on where you are making sense of these dynamics. Europe is not the same as North America. Australia is similar to New Zealand and Canada, but different in many respects from America. Some parts of Southeast Asia have similarities, and yet there are differences. But to consider ethnic conflict alongside cultural assimilation, ethnic accommodation is a very good thing to be doing. So we're going to pause now, and then we're going to keep reading on in chapter 5.